everyone. Today I'm joined by a very important guest. His name is Trevor, and he's from the History of Persia podcast, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
Correct. Hi, how are you?
You're pretty good. Doing pretty well. How are you doing today?
I'm all right.
Okay. I do have to ask you because, what kind of got you into like Persian history?
Right. So I started encountering Persia as part of a religious studies class in my freshman year of college,
Okay.
through the study of Zoroastrianism. It was a course on the origins of different religions, going through in a mostly chronological order. And part of the class was the TA convinced the professor to give us extra credit for doing a response essay to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast on the ancient Persians. That podcast doesn't mention religion at all, but it was relevant enough that she got it included. And when it came around to time to write our term papers, I was a contrarian 18-year-old and wanted to pick a topic nobody else was ever going to cover. So I went with Zoroastrianism and wrote about the history of its origins, going off of the idea that I had encountered through that podcast, which was its relationship to ancient Persia, and went down the rabbit hole from there. Started studying it on my own and taking classes that I could make relevant to it, even if they weren't technically relevant in the syllabus. And from there, just kind of got into it on my own, and changed some of my degree path around that.
Okay, it's interesting. You know what's actually funny when I was actually traveling to India and over there I actually saw like a Zoroastrian temple. I remember seeing it.
Oh yeah, were you in Mumbai?
Yeah, I think it might have been actually.
Yeah,
Yeah, either that or it was New Delhi. I don't remember. Yeah.
there's a very large Zoroastrian community called the Parsis,
Yeah.
in and around Mumbai.
Yeah. I think it was called a Parsi temple or something like that, if I
Yeah,
recall.
and I should make it clear to anybody listening, when I say very large, I mean very large compared to a group whose global population is somewhere around 200,000 people.
Oh
Today, it
really?
is a
Okay.
very small religion, despite being one of the great and widespread religions of ancient history.
Yeah. I actually have an interesting question. Maybe you can answer it. I know like nowadays they don't really accept converts in Zoroastrianism, but like historically, did they accept converts? Do you know of that? Or
Yes, they did, and that's a specifically Indian and Parsi phenomenon, really.
okay,
There hasn't been much drive in other places for people to convert to Zoroastrianism for most of the last 1300 years. But strictly speaking, like the Iranian community never had a prohibition against it. It's just there were more people converting out of Zoroastrianism and into Islam than the other way around.
yeah, no, that makes sense. I know the main like figure of Zoroastrianism is like Prophet Zoroaster, right?
Yes.
Okay. Now obviously like this was obviously like somewhat like it's a pretty ancient religion, of course, that has been around for a while and surprisingly it has like still survived to this day.
Yeah. Based on our best estimates from analyzing the language in the scripture and when people started referencing Zoroaster and how they referenced him, the estimate is around 1300 BC for when he was doing his actual personal preaching.
Okay, okay. And I know even like in Zoroastrianism they have like I guess like sects within that. And I think one of them was like Mazdakism, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
Yes, Mazdakism's a really interesting topic within ancient Persia and Zoroastrianism. Uh, it refers to a specific, like lower level priest who gained prominence and got in with the royal court during the Sassanid Persian Empire around the late 400s CE. And it preached a kind of communalist ideal, share property, hold everything in common,
Yeah.
Strip a lot of the property power away from the nobility.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder that started gaining a lot of popularity during a drought. And irritated the nobility so much they chased the king in question, Kabad the First, out of the country.
Yeah. And I know obviously that one was a specific sect, but I think there was also another religion, and I think it's very minor. Like during that time, there was, I believe it's called Manichaeism. If I'm,
Manichaeism?
yeah,
Yeah. Uh, that's another interesting one. It started with a prophet named Mani in
yeah,
the area around Babylon, about, I want to say, 100 years before the Mazdakites. And it took elements of Zoroastrianism and a little bit of Buddhism, which was starting to spread into the Persian Empire around then, and mixed them in with specifically the Gnostic side of Christianity, and which gets into a lot of really unconventional by today's standards metaphysics and philosophy about the universe.
yeah. I think there's only like a very, very small like minority community that exists, like maybe in China. That's what I've heard, right?
There at least was into the early modern period. Strictly speaking, I don't think anybody identifies as Manichaean or original Manichaean anymore.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's neo-Manichaean communities, just like there's neo everything else now. But
yeah,
uh, it definitely had an impact on some schools of Chinese philosophy.
yeah. No, that's true. And I know there's obviously like various Persian like Persian empires, right? And of course, each one like most of them, I would say, probably adopted Zoroastrianism more than the minor religions that we mentioned. Like
Yes.
more than like,
No, go ahead.
I don't know. I was just saying like more than likely they probably adopted Zoroastrianism. Like
Yes, they all started with it. As far as we can tell, the first Persian Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty,
yeah,
already had some form of Zoroastrianism when it got started in the 6th century BCE. But of course, at that point, the Zoroastrian scripture called the Avesta was still being written. It's a lot like the Bible in that it's a bunch of different works written over the course of many centuries. So,
yes,
you'll run into academics debating, oh, well, was it really Zoroastrianism if it didn't have this, this, and this? And well, of course it didn't have that. That part hadn't been written yet, but that doesn't make it less derived from the prophet Zoroaster. So I think it counts.
yeah. No, that's a good point. And I know obviously like you mentioned the Achaemenid Empire that started off with Cyrus the Great specifically, right?
Yes, Cyrus the Great uh, staged a rebellion against the existing big empire in the region at the time called the Medes. He was probably about 40 years old and the vassal of the Median king Astyages, who was also his maternal grandfather. And in the course of about 3 years, he not only conquered his grandfather's empire, but convinced most of the Median elite and generals to come over to his side.
Wow, okay. I know he has many origin stories if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes. Uh, the most likely one is just that he was a prince, he grew up as a prince, did princely things, and eventually became king of the little tiny vassal kingdom of Persia at the time before his rebellion. And there's a sort of version of that story told by the ancient Greek author Xenophon in a book called the Cyropaedia, which means the education of Cyrus. But a lot of that book is also just ancient historical fiction. Uh, you also have accounts from Herodotus, who describes how Cyrus was the grandson of King Astyages by his daughter, but Astyages had these dreams of his daughter's son rising up and destroying his kingdom and taking everything from him. So he went and had one of his generals try to kill the baby Cyrus, but the general got cold feet at the last minute and hid Cyrus with a peasant family, only for Cyrus to be discovered because he was playing a game with the other children and acting just too innately royal to be a peasant, whatever that meant to Herodotus at the time. And the last one is from another Greek author called Ctesias, writing a few hundred years after Herodotus, around the same time as Xenophon. And he said that Cyrus was never royalty at all and was just a bandit warlord who just fought his way to the top.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Greek accounts are kind of interesting because they give kind of a bit more of like I guess like a more of a bizarre like origin story.
Yes,
It's kind of similar
absolutely.
to mythology in a way.
Yeah, especially the Herodotus version where he's hidden
Yeah.
with a peasant family. The archetype of the hero who's raised outside of his original circumstances is very, very old. It goes back
Yeah.
at least to Sargon of Akkad, the founder of the first real empire in human history. And then we see it with Moses, and we see it with, even in modern times, they use it for Superman. There's all sorts of
Yeah.
examples of that.
Yeah. I think they even used it in the Iliad where I think like Paris is like hidden away and raised somewhere else, right?
Yeah, well, at least in the epic cycle from
Yeah.
Greek mythology, the Iliad uh, is this giant book when you look at it on a shelf, but it actually only covers about like a couple days worth of events.
Yeah. That was true. Now, with Cyrus the Great, obviously there's like I don't think it's necessarily established per se that he was Zoroastrian, but more than likely it's assumed that he was, right?
Correct. Yeah, there's really not proof of very much at all with Cyrus. We don't have a lot of sources contemporary with him, and the ones we do have are his appeals to the Babylonian people, trying to
Yeah.
legitimize himself as their ruler. So he doesn't, we don't have a lot of information about his personal life
Yeah.
outside of what's told in later stories.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. And with like what is it? With Cyrus the Great, trying to remember. Dang it. I just lost my question. I'm trying to remember. I know with I know he was like raised in like a specific like city before he actually conquered like established the Persian Empire, right?
Right. Uh, Cyrus was most likely born and raised in a city called Anshan.
Yeah,
That was one of the capitals of the very, very ancient Elamite culture. That was the predominant group in Babylon or in southern Iran before the end of the Bronze Age.
yeah. No, obviously with like Cyrus the Great, since oh, and I remember what I was gonna say. He's like one of the few people that um was like one of the few like people that aren't isn't Jewish that was praised in the Bible, right?
Yes, he is the only non-Jew in the entirety of the Bible to be given the title Messiah,
Okay.
because about 70 years before he took over Babylon, the Jews, or at least the population of Jerusalem, had been sent into exile by the Babylonians. And he officially ended that deportation and allowed people to start returning home.
Yeah. Now, obviously, I think Cyrus the Great also had like a son, Cambyses the second, right?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Oh no, I said Cyrus the Great also had like a son, and his name was Cambyses the second, right?
Yes. And he is best known for conquering Egypt.
Yeah, I remember I talked about like his conquest in Egypt, specifically like the Battle of Pelusium on my like cousin's like podcast, and like I was telling him about it, and he's like, "No way, is that actually like a true like historical event?" And I'm like, "Yeah, apparently it is."
Yes, the Battle of Pelusium is, at the very least, the battle itself definitely happened. Pelusium
Yeah,
was kind of the gateway to the Nile River from Persian territory. So there was really no way through the Sinai without going there. There is the very famous story from the Greek historian Polyaenus that says that the Persians strapped cats to their shields to dissuade the Egyptian spears. Whether or not that's true is up for debate, and it doesn't make a ton of sense in a historical perspective, but it did lead to that great painting of a Persian soldier throwing a cat over the walls.
I've heard, and if I'm not mistaken, I've also heard that it was possible that they might have painted cats over their shields, right? Would that have been like a possibility?
That is one possible interpretation, just to try and make it make sense,
Yeah,
and maybe less horrifyingly cruel to animals.
yeah,
But we don't have any documents of it.
yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the first example of like psychological warfare, right? Pretty much.
Yes. Uh, at least one of. There are other examples, of very basic psychological warfare, like chanting battle hymns and you know uh, different types of armor, ceremonial outfits used to try and intimidate people. But that kind of specific appeal to a certain part of culture is not something you hear a lot about.
Yeah, because like obviously like he knew that Persians kind of like revered cats and like animals in general, right? And basically worshiped them by using
Yeah,
them.
yeah. Cats specifically in Egypt were associated with a goddess called Best, and or Basset, and were extremely important. There's another couple of animals that have different levels of sanctity and things like that, but cats are
Yeah,
one of the only ones where all of them got the same kind of pride of place.
yeah, no, that's true. And if I'm not, I just remembered it was like when Cambyses second, like when he conquered Egypt specifically, he was actually the one that technically ended the Egyptian like dynasty, pretty much.
Yeah, he conquered the last of the
Pharaohs.
independent, he marks the end of real Egyptian independence. There's
Yeah,
a moment in the very late Achaemenid period where Egypt regains its independence for a couple of decades. I think it's around 40 years, but it never quite sticks. They go through several dynasties of their own in that period, and they get reconquered by Persia in the end. But ironically, the dynasty conquered by Cambyses itself wasn't even originally Egyptian. They were a Libyan dynasty that had been picked out by the Egypt or the Assyrians when they conquered Egypt.
really? Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, if excluding the about 30 years of genuinely Egyptian rulers that happen in the middle of the Persian period, the last truly native Egyptian dynasty uh, ended in, I want to say, the 700s BC.
700. Okay, that was pretty well back then. And like I was gonna ask you, like, what personally is your favorite like Persian like king that you've studied?
My favorite to talk about is probably Artaxerxes II.
Okay.
And he's actually the one who lost Egypt through no fault of his own. Um, he came to power, and the empire was in a pretty strong, pretty good place. They had just finished a war where they participated in the Peloponnesian War up in Greece. They had an alliance with Sparta going for them. Everything was working in their favor, but Artaxerxes II's brother, Cyrus the Younger, contested the throne. And if you've heard of the March of the 10,000
Yeah.
from Xenophon and his Anabasis, this is the event that starts that. Cyrus the Younger starts a civil war, and he fights his brother in battle and very nearly wins, only to get killed by a random infantry officer in the melee.
This
And
is
from
before, if you don't mind me asking, like, is this before Darius the Third, right?
Yes, this is before Darius III and Alexander the Great. So this is really at the height of the empire's power,
Yeah.
and also very much the time where it starts falling apart. Artaxerxes II's war with Cyrus also leads to a war with Sparta because they backed Cyrus the Younger in the Persian Civil War, and that drags Persia into the Corinthian War up in Greece, which lasts for about 20 years. And while that's going on, there's a rebellion in Cyprus, and they're still trying to retake Egypt because it rebelled and, with the civil war going on, was able to secede entirely. And then all of this chaos leads to this, and warfare leads to this huge population of mercenaries in the Eastern Mediterranean region, and a lot of dissatisfied satraps, the Persian governors. And on top of that, Artaxerxes started executing generals who failed to take Egypt. So one of those generals just refused to go, hired a bunch of mercenaries, and started raising rebellion in the area of modern Turkey. And it spawned this giant conflict called the Great Satraps Revolt. They tried to recruit aid from Egypt. Egypt wholesale invaded the Persian Empire. They took over most of the modern Levant, so most of the coast of Lebanon and modern Israel. And this lasted from the beginning of the 360s BC right to about 359 when Artaxerxes II died. And the war only wrapped up maybe within a couple months of his death.
Okay.
And then the Persian king who I think is most interesting is his son, Artaxerxes III, because he worked out a way to deal with that and actually got everything back on track until he was assassinated.
So you like his son a bit more, or do you like father more?
I think the father is a more interesting story, and I think Artaxerxes III is a better king.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. And would you say this is before like the Battle of Thermopylae, right? Or is this after?
This is after.
Oh, this is after.
Yeah. So when you hear me talking about the wars with Greece and Artaxerxes II in there, this is all after the famous Greco-Persian wars where Xerxes invaded Greece, and you have the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Salome, where they get the Persians beat the Spartan last stand at Thermopylae, but then their fleet gets destroyed at Salome, and that kind of ruins the campaign for them. That's all about 100 years before any of this stuff I just talked about happened.
Okay.
There is about 100 years straight of almost nonstop war between either Sparta or Athens and the Persian Empire.
Makes sense. And during all this time, obviously the Persian like language back then was very different. Right?
Sorry?
Well, I said that back then the Persian language was obviously different, right?
Language, yes. The stage that we call it in the Achaemenid period is, we call it Old Persian. And, because it's very creative. And it was very different from modern Persian or Farsi, however you want to call it. It was written in the cuneiform script, but not the same exact way that other cuneiform languages were. The original lines and wedges from ancient Mesopotamia were usually one symbol equaled one syllable of a word, And the Persians under Darius the Great just took that style and made an alphabet out of it. So they simplified it significantly, but all of the words are a lot more complicated. They all have, uh, many syllables that have kind of dropped out over time, uh, declensions and cases represented with different endings, a bit like Latin. Uh, and all of this is stuff that slowly faded out over time and was already starting to go away by the end of the Achaemenids.
Okay. And that's what like the Cyrus cylinder was kind of like written in.
Yes, the Cyrus cylinder was written in Akkadian, the
Akkadian, okay.
original cuneiform language of Babylon, because the Cyrus cylinder was addressed to a Babylonian audience specifically. And Cyrus lived before they invented an old Persian alphabet.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. And out of like, obviously, like as you mentioned, who would you say, in like your personal opinion, was like probably the best king in the Achaemenid Empire?
Oh, we are recording this a couple weeks before my 100th episode goes out. I don't know if it'll be out by the time you release this. And I actually rank the kings for that episode. It's
Really?
Darius the Great. Darius, by a huge margin, the best king the Achaemenid Empire ever had, because he did come to power through a coup. And that did cause a massive civil war that encompassed almost the entire empire on about 9 different fronts. But that also meant that he essentially reconquered the empire from scratch and then went on to expand it. He's the one who conquered India, or the Indus River Valley more accurately. He's the one who pushed the Persians into Europe for the first time, taking over most of the Balkans and the area around the Black Sea. He dealt with the Greek rebellion very successfully, even if his attempt to take vengeance on Athens with the Battle of Marathon wasn't. And he is the king credited with a lot of the administrative reforms that made the empire function. He started minting the first coins. He's developed a postal system and a road system. He commissioned the invention of an alphabet. He commissioned the construction of the main capital of Persepolis. Darius the Great kind of took a bunch of places that Cyrus and Cambyses had conquered and turned them into a coherent, functioning state.
And obviously, like that's actually interesting. So Darius the Great, you would say like pretty much the best king.
Yeah,
like okay,
hands down.
okay, it's interesting. And at the height of his empire, you said it's like stretched from like the Indus all the way to the Balkans, right?
Yeah, the Indus River itself is usually where we draw the line on maps. Realistically, we
Yeah.
have to assume like they projected power a little bit past the river because it would be weird not to. And then at its absolute maximum for about a year in 479 BC, when between the Battle of Thermopylae and when the Persians got forced out of Greece, they stretched all the way to about halfway through the Greek peninsula.
Okay. And of course, obviously, when I guess like his descendants, Darius the Third, right? He's the one that's unfortunately like because of Alexander the Great. That's when like the Achaemenid Empire like pretty much like fell. Right.
Correct. Yeah, Darius the Third was the last king to rule the entire empire. He came to power through semi-legitimate means. He was the great-grandson of Darius II.
Okay.
And in between those two, there were 3 different Artaxerxes, and the last 2 were killed by a courtier named Bagoas, who poisoned them both one after the other, which led to Darius III being appointed by him and when Alexander showed up, he was on really shaky ground in terms of legitimacy, which is probably what led to some very poor decision making during Alexander's initial invasion.
Oh, that's interesting. Now, when Alexander the Great, when he, funny enough, went to Egypt, he was seen as like the liberator of Egypt, right?
Yes, the Egyptians staged a revolt against almost every single Persian king, um, and did not like foreign rule. So when somebody showed up who was going to kick the Persians out, they were ready for it. They surrendered to Alexander without a fight. They accepted him. They named him Pharaoh. But in like the long run of history, it's real hard to tell if they were excited about Alexander personally or if they just thought, well, there's no way he'll be as powerful as the Persians. We can just kick these Greeks out later.
Yeah, that's true.
And
I
then they
mean,
ended
I
up ruled
remember,
by Greeks for 500 years.
yeah. And the funny thing is, I remember it was like Darius III, like he pretty much like was telling Alexander the Great, like, hey, you can keep like half the empire, and basically trying to come up with terms, and then Alexander's like, no, I want like the whole thing.
Yeah, I think if Darius had offered a settlement earlier on, Alexander probably would have taken it. But
Yeah,
there's no way that Darius would realistically give up Egypt willingly because it was just so valuable. It produced so much gold and grain.
yeah,
And to get to Egypt, Alexander had to fight him in the field and was so successful in that battle called the Battle of Issus that by the time he faced Darius III on the field again, he had absolutely no doubt in his mind that he was going to win.
and obviously, like from what I've heard, is that Alexander the Great, like, I mean, the Persian Empire was kind of like already like established, and then he kind of like established it again, like in his own way, per se, kind of, right? Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, he conquered the whole thing, one region at a time,
Yeah,
and adopted a lot of the court practices and clothing and ceremony from the Persians. You know, in part because it's not like Greece or Macedon had ever ruled an empire like this before. And everybody who ruled something similar just copied what the Persians did because they had been what defined being a large kingdom for many centuries. So Alexander acted like what he thought an emperor acted like, and that's acting like a Persian, which upset some of his nobility, but there wasn't much they could do about it in practice.
yeah,
Um, but a lot of historians kind of view Alexander as the last Achaemenid in a, you know, at least honorary sense.
yeah. At least like in that, like I guess like fashion that way.
Yeah.
So obviously, like I mean, once like he died, like there were like many like I guess like Persian type of like empires that arose after that. Right?
Yeah. Alexander died, and basically, while his body was still warm, his generals divided up the empire amongst themselves. They officially had his newborn son as a regent and a regent for a few, but within 2 or 3 years, they were fighting each other for control.
Yeah,
The bulk of the empire went to a general named Seleucus, and that forms the Seleucid Empire
yeah,
that controlled most of what had been Persia, aside from Egypt and bits of modern Turkey. But most of those bits of modern Turkey were actually ruled by minor kingdoms of, or ruled by people of Persian descent.
okay, okay. And obviously there were like many, even the Parthian Empire, right, which was kind of like somewhat like Persian and Sasanian Empire as well, right?
Yeah, the Parthians are an interesting case. They were steppe nomads. You could lump them in with the idea of Scythians who
Oh,
invaded the Seleucid Empire a couple of times before taking over most of it. And they adopted a combination of Greek culture and culture from the region of Parthia, where they initially invaded, but they showed a lot of knowledge of the Achaemenids. They took on Achaemenid titles like King of Kings. They took on, some mythology claiming to be related to the Achaemenids. And they ruled until the 3rd century CE, when a dynasty of priest kings who had been like the vassal rulers in Persia proper, like the province of Fars in southern Iran, rose up and usurped the Parthian Empire. They basically just took over the existing thing and made themselves king.
Now, obviously, like there were obviously like a lot of these Persian like empires afterwards, but I mean, unless you like the Achaemenid Empire, which one would you say like probably your favorite to study?
Oh, the Achaemenids are my favorite to study. Partly just because they're really straightforward. There's a lot of drama and there's a lot of mystery, but and are a bit better documented internally than the later ones, partly because they kept records on clay. The time you get around to the Parthians, the Sassanids, everything's on paper.
Okay, sense.
We've just lost access to it.
Okay. So before we end off, do you have any like final words you want to say, or anything you didn't get off your chest, I guess?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I can just tell people where to find me and stuff, if that's all right.
Okay. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, you can find my podcast, presumably wherever you're listening to this. It'll be coming onto YouTube slowly over the next month or so. And you can follow me at historyofpersiapodcast.com, History of Persia Podcast on Facebook or Instagram, and History of Persia Podcast, or just History of Persia, on Twitter and whatever comes after it.
Yeah. I do have to say you're honestly pretty knowledgeable on this subject. I like it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I was going to get my master's degree in it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. But I'd love to do like another episode sometime in the future as well. This is honestly like
Yeah, of course.
yeah. Because like Persian history specifically, I feel like a lot of people study Greece or Rome, like maybe even Egypt, right? But I don't think a lot of people look into Persian history, right? And because I mean it's a shame because it's like I mean they did a lot,
Yeah,
historically speaking.
no, they're really impressive politically and culturally, and have a massive historical legacy. I mean, Iran is one of the few places that resisted Arabization, that was conquered in the initial wave of Arab conquest. So there's this huge legacy to it, and they're just really often presented as the villains in other historical stories,
Yeah.
which is one of the things that blew my mind and made me interested in them when I learned about them on their own right for the first time. Was, wait, there's all this information here. Why haven't I heard it?
Yeah, it's true. So for everyone that enjoyed the podcast, please like and subscribe, hit that bell notification, and until next time, peace.